So here's an irony so profound, it would be almost funny if people weren't literally freezing to death. For years, Russian state media ran propaganda showing Europeans shivering in the dark, mocking European dependence on Russian energy, threatening gas cutoffs, broadcasting images of cold, powerless cities across Europe struggling without Russian gas and oil. The message was clear. Russia controls the energy. Russia holds the power. Europe will freeze if it defies Moscow. This winter, it's Russian citizens who are freezing, not in some remote Siberian outpost, in Moscow suburbs, in major cities from Vladivostok to Podolsk, hundreds of thousands of people without heat. Burst pipes, frozen apartments, temperatures inside homes dropping to near freezing while outside it's -20, -30 degrees Celsius. And this is happening in the world's largest energy exporter. The nation that supplies a significant portion of global oil and gas can't keep its own population warm. Let me explain how this happened, because it's not a technical failure. It's a systems failure. It's what happens when a war economy completely inverts a nation's priorities. Russia's infrastructure, particularly its massive Soviet-era central heating systems, require constant maintenance and periodic upgrades. These systems are enormous. Entire city districts are heated from central plants that pump hot water through kilometers of underground pipes to apartment buildings. It's efficient when it works, but it requires specialized workers, regular maintenance, and significant investment. The war economy didn't just redirect some resources to the military, it consumed everything. The welders who could repair burst heating pipes are either at the front or working in defense factories. The engineers who could maintain the systems have been conscripted or have fled the country. The budget allocations for urban infrastructure maintenance have been reallocated to weapons production. Every ruble, every skilled worker, every unit of attention has been redirected toward the war machine. And now, the bills are coming due. Not in military defeats, in frozen apartments, in burst pipes that nobody can fix because there's nobody available to fix them, in heating systems that fail because maintenance was deferred year after year, while the budget went to tanks and missiles. The Kremlin will spend millions to destroy a Ukrainian apartment building, but won't spend the equivalent of a few $100s to repair a heating system in a Russian city. Start with Podolsk, a city just south of Moscow. In December 2024, the central heating system serving multiple residential districts failed completely. Tens of thousands of people without heat in the middle of winter. The official explanation was technical failure. A pipe burst. But here's the detail that matters. The pipe burst because it hadn't been properly maintained, and it couldn't be quickly repaired because the specialized workers weren't available. They're not available because they're either conscripted, working in defense industries, or have left the country entirely. Residents were told repairs would take days, then weeks. Some were offered temporary electric heaters, but the electrical systems in these Soviet-era buildings weren't designed to handle that load. So you have people choosing between freezing or risking electrical fires. Parents sending children to stay with relatives because apartments are uninhabitable. Elderly people, the ones who can't easily relocate, just enduring sub-zero temperatures inside their homes. Vladivostok on Russia's Pacific coast. Similar story. Heating system failures affecting thousands of residents. The infrastructure there is particularly old, dating back to Soviet construction in the 1960s and 70s. It needed major renovation years ago, but major renovation costs money and requires workers, and both money and workers have been redirected to the war effort, so the systems limp along until they catastrophically fail. And when they fail, there's no quick fix, because the capacity to fix them has been stripped away. This is happening across Russia, not everywhere simultaneously, but in waves. One city's heating system fails. It gets some attention, some emergency measures. But then, another city's system fails. And another. The infrastructure maintenance backlog is so massive at this point that failures are inevitable. It's not a question of if, but when and where. And here's what makes this particularly devastating to Putin's social contract with the Russian people. That contract, never explicitly stated but always understood, was simple. You give up political freedom. You don't question the government. You don't protest. You accept authoritarian rule. In exchange, you get stability. You get basic services. You get heat in winter, consistent electricity, functioning infrastructure. That was the deal. Now Russians have no political freedom, no ability to protest, no mechanism to hold government accountable, and no heat. The deal is broken. And they're discovering it in the most visceral way possible. Not through abstract political theory, but through freezing in their own homes while the government that took their freedom can't or won't provide the basic services that were supposed to be guaranteed in return. Russian state television isn't showing this. They're not broadcasting images of frozen Russian apartments the way they broadcast images of European energy concerns. The propaganda machine that spent years mocking European energy vulnerability is silent about Russian energy infrastructure collapse. Because acknowledging it would be acknowledging that the war economy has failed at the most basic level. It cannot maintain the systems that keep the population alive. But people know. You can't hide burst pipes from the people living in the apartments. You can't hide heating system failures from the families shivering at night. Social media posts, even with censorship, are getting through. Videos of ice forming inside apartments. Posts about elderly neighbors found suffering from hypothermia, complaints about authorities who promise repairs that never come, and the regional disparities make it worse. Moscow city center generally maintains better infrastructure because that's where political power is concentrated. But Moscow's suburbs, provincial cities, anything outside the immediate visibility of central authority, that's where systems are failing. It creates a geographic inequality that maps perfectly onto political power. The closer you are to the Kremlin, the more likely your heat works. The further away, the more likely you're on your own. This violates something deeper than a political contract. It violates basic human expectations. Russia is a cold country. Heating infrastructure isn't a luxury. It's survival infrastructure. Russians have endured extraordinary hardship throughout their history. But even during the worst of Soviet times, even during the collapse of the 90s, even during World War II, keeping people from freezing was treated as an absolute minimum requirement. The state might fail in many ways, but basic heating was sacrosanct. That sacrosanct status is gone. The war economy has consumed even that. And what's being revealed is the complete perversion of the regime's priorities. Russia exports energy to generate revenue for the state. That revenue goes to weapons production. Those weapons destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, including heating systems in Ukrainian cities. Meanwhile, Russian heating systems fail from lack of maintenance, and Russian citizens freeze. The state is using energy exports to fund the destruction of another country's heating, while its own heating fails from neglect. The economic irony is brutal. Russia is earning tens of billions from energy exports. Oil and gas sales, even with sanctions and price caps, still generate enormous revenue. But that revenue doesn't flow back to domestic infrastructure. It flows to military production, to maintaining the security apparatus, to keeping the war machine running. A tiny fraction of oil export revenue would be sufficient to maintain every heating system in Russia. But that fraction isn't allocated because maintaining domestic infrastructure isn't the priority. The priority is projection of power abroad, even as the foundation at home crumbles. And there's no quick fix. Even if tomorrow the Russian government decided to prioritize infrastructure repair, they couldn't immediately implement it. The workers are gone. The engineers have been conscripted or fled. The supply chains for specialized parts are disrupted. The institutional knowledge of how to maintain these systems has been eroded. The damage compounds. Every winter that passes with deferred maintenance makes the next winter's failures more likely and more severe. Think about what this means for regime stability. Putin's support has always rested on a perception of competence and delivery of basic services. Not democracy, not freedom, but competence. The trains run, the power stays on, the heat works. That competence is now visibly failing in the most literal way. People are cold, in their homes, in the winter, in Russia, a country defined by its harsh winters and its population's historical resilience to cold, is seeing its citizens freeze because the government cannot maintain basic infrastructure. The propaganda machine tries to redirect attention. It's Ukraine's fault for forcing Russia into war. It's the West's fault for sanctions. It's local officials' fault for corruption and mismanagement. But people freezing in their apartments don't care about blame allocation. They care about heat. And the heat isn't working. And no amount of propaganda changes the temperature inside a frozen apartment. There's also a regional fragmentation dimension here. When federal authorities can't provide basic services, regional authorities start making their own decisions. Some regions are better equipped or better funded than others. Some have local energy sources or more functional maintenance systems. This creates patchwork outcomes. One region maintains heating. The neighboring region doesn't. That undermines the narrative of a unified Russian state and strengthens regional identities and grievances against the center. In resource-rich regions like Tatarstan or Yakutia, local populations see energy being extracted from their territory and exported while their own infrastructure fails. That creates a very dangerous question. If Moscow can't or won't provide basic services, why should we remain part of this system? That question isn't hypothetical. It's being asked right now in living rooms and kitchens across Russia's periphery. And winter isn't over. We're in December 2024. January and February are typically the coldest months. The heating systems that are failing now in relatively mild cold will be under even more stress as temperatures drop further. More pipes will burst, more systems will fail, more people will freeze. And every failure reinforces the perception that the state cannot perform its most basic function. The international implications are significant too. Russia positioned itself as an energy superpower, the nation that could dictate terms to Europe through energy leverage, the nation whose energy resources gave it geopolitical power. But a country that can't heat its own cities isn't an energy superpower. It's an energy extraction operation that's failing its own population. That undermines Russia's geopolitical narrative. If you can't keep your own people warm, how credible are your threats to freeze others? European officials are certainly noticing. The same Russian government that threatened to freeze Europe is allowing its own citizens to freeze. That reveals priorities and capabilities. It reveals that Russia's energy leverage was always more performative than substantial, and it reveals that Russia's internal systems are far more fragile than the propaganda suggested. This is what regime decay looks like from the inside. Not a dramatic collapse, not a revolution, just systems failing, infrastructure breaking down, services that were taken for granted becoming unreliable, the slow erosion of state capacity to perform basic functions, and the growing gap between the state's claims about its power and strength versus the reality that citizens experience every day. Putin built his legitimacy on a promise of order and competence after the chaos of the 90s, strong state, reliable services, national pride. The heat working was part of that promise. It was so basic it didn't need to be stated. Of course the heat works. We're Russia. We understand winter. Heating infrastructure is fundamental, except now it doesn't work. And the excuse is that resources went to a war that was supposed to be quick and decisive and is now in its third year with no end in sight. Russian citizens are discovering that the war economy has made them poorer, colder, and less secure. Not in abstract economic statistics, in frozen apartments, in burst pipes, in elderly neighbors suffering from hypothermia, in children sent away because homes are uninhabitable. The cost of the war isn't just being paid in casualties at the front, it's being paid in every frozen apartment across Russia. This winter, the propaganda about freezing Europeans looks like projection. The thing Russia threatened to do to others, it's doing to itself. Not through enemy action, not through sanctions, through its own choices, through prioritizing military aggression over basic infrastructure, through consuming its own capacity to maintain the systems that keep people alive. The frozen apartments aren't a military defeat. They're something potentially more dangerous to the regime. They're a demonstration that the state cannot fulfill its most basic obligation. In a country defined by brutal winters, the heating doesn't work. And no amount of propaganda about national greatness or military strength can warm a frozen apartment. When people are cold in their homes, the legitimacy of power comes into question in the most fundamental way. The fortress isn't just frozen. It's freezing from within. And the cold reveals what propaganda cannot hide, that the war economy has inverted everything, that the state can destroy but cannot maintain, that power projection abroad requires the consumption of basic services at home, and that when citizens freeze in the world's largest energy exporting nation, the emperor isn't just naked, he's shivering,